to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting today. We have a pretty full agenda, so I just kind of want to dive right in. Rich isn't going to be here today, so you're all stuck with me facilitating and running the meeting. But, just really briefly, the agenda, it is pretty full. Do we do some administrative things to start? Then we have some recommendations from the Transportation Task Group in preparation for the September council meeting. Also, a little later in the agenda, some budget priorities in preparation for the September council meeting as well. But before we get to that, update on the thermal sector RFP and the biomass task group. Any comments on the agenda? Additions or moving it around? So hearing none, we'll just go into the approval of the minutes. The June 16th minutes were linked in the agenda. Does anybody have any comments or changes on the minutes? Hearing none, we'll consider those approved. Thank you. And then next up on the agenda is an item on the subcommittee composition. Cross-sector is the one committee that doesn't have a youth member yet, and there was a youth nominee, but due to vacation schedules, Rich and I haven't been able to connect with her. So we're hoping to be able to discuss with her kind of the committee and bring a recommendation to you today, but to potentially make a recommendation to the steering committee, but we can't do that today, so we'll have to stay that till the next meeting. And so moving right along here, we just hopefully now we even have a couple extra minutes for you, Joey, in the transportation recommendation sector. And we can just dive right into some of the substance here. So transportation task group's been hard at work. And I think it's going to be you, Joey, to kind of explain what you're up to and the recommendations that were linked in the agenda and sent around earlier this week.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, TJ. Nice to see everyone. And I'll let Gina and Jared and others who've been participating in that task group sort of round out what I lay out. But essentially, yeah, we've been meeting pretty much weekly for a while, just to sort of, on several different components of transportation work, and including the advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks rulemaking, which, as people know, did move through ICAR, and we've been talking and working a lot about on the stakeholder outreach and engagement, which is great. But what we're here to talk about today is, how our initial recommendation for consideration of cross-sector to start the process to do what we said we were going to do and deliver on making a recommendation that related to the gap that the Transportation Climate Initiative program cratering at the end of November last year left in the plan. And so, I don't want to, we went through a process, we've gathered public input. This is informed, as you see laid out in the memo. This is built on the initial memo that we put forth in January, as well as the February 2022 proposed process and public engagement plan. And, we've been hard at work, trying to, pick up the pieces and make the case from here. And so that's the conversation we want to have with you all, but we've had very robust conversations in the task group, and I think we didn't have a formal vote, but I think what we delivered to you in this document is, I think, a consensus suggested pathway forward in terms of next steps. But what I want to underscore too is that, since we adopted the climate action plan in December, as people know, the state of Vermont has gotten significant federal funding. A big component that related to the transportation space, as you saw in our memo, is that for the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, the Agency of Transportation, VTrans, is required to develop a carbon reduction strategy. And they're in that process now. It's a longer process, as you see laid out here in the memo. There's the first phase, which should be complete by the start of the 2023 legislative session, which establishes a methodology for evaluation of the capital program, like assessing, how Vermont's current programs are adding up to carbon reductions, and to inform again, like, what is the gap we need to fill and where do we need to do more work. But then the timetable for phase 2, developing an investment strategy, is a little farther along. So, and I share that with you just to essentially say what we had discussed is what we really want to do is understand, what the baseline is, how much current work, how far current programs will take us, and how far these unprecedented investments will also take us, and then what's the gap that we need to leave. So we, as you all know, we have lacked the funding and time in part to do the sort of economic analysis and even more robust public input than we would like to. But we also recognize that we have an obligation, a legal obligation, and the Global Warming Solutions Act, a moral obligation to do our part on climate. And what we have put forward for you is a primary sort of recommendation with other ensuing steps is to really just point in a direction that says we need to pursue a comparable either cap and invest program or some other policy or program, such as a performance-based standard that's going to close any gap that we may very well have and we are likely to have. So we don't know what that preferred approach is. So we have also, but we know that we need a likely policy or regulatory tool that will deliver a level of certainty to again meet the legal and moral obligation in front of us. So we've also recommended, again, as you can see in the bullets, to continue to follow through on what we identified and laid out as recommendations in the plan. So that is just a fundamental starting point. And again, we've made progress and success to lift, well, at least this far along in the process, advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks. We also have recognized that there's more work to do to lay the foundation for any potential policy or regulatory program, and that we want to make sure that we are setting the table to structure incentives and programs to target to drive investments to where they will deliver the most strategic greenhouse gas emission reductions, and to help lower income, historically overburdened Vermonters, prioritize them in the programs that we are delivering. And so Chris Campany has really been leading this charge, and this is a really important piece of work. So set the stage to do the work to really identify how we, prioritize those who have to use their vehicles or more than others. So that's a component of it. What that looks like is a little more smushy, but to be determined. We also have recognized that we really need timely and accurate data. So a recommendation you will see in the second to last bullet is that the ANR establish a greenhouse gas emissions reporting program, and if appropriate, work with other agencies to develop a universal reporting program, again, just as a fundamental foundation of necessary information to craft any potential recommendation and policy. And then, of course, through this entire process, continuing to ramp outreach and public engagement to identify a preferred, what that preferred policy or regulatory approach would be, either a cap and invest program, like the Transportation Climate Initiative program, if it's revamped, like the Western Climate Initiative, or a performance-based standard. So we need to do that work, inform any potential more concrete recommendation that we would have through public engagement, and doing that work ideally in better partnership with the Just Transition Subcommittee. So, okay, that's a lot that I just laid on you, and I guess I would invite Gina, Bram, Jared, anyone else to round out what I just shared. But our fundamental goal was just to recognize that we, we're going to make some progress with the work that we're already doing with the expanded investments that we're going to be making through infrastructure dollars through, once the Inflation Reduction Act gains ground, maximize the opportunity we have with the programs and the funding in front of us, but then also recognize that we do not have a policy or regulatory tool that will deliver with a high degree of certainty on our legal pollution reduction obligation. And so we want to start that process. And this is our recommended pathway for going about identifying what that preferred strategy would be. So that's a distillation of many months of conversation, and hope I didn't overwhelm you. Anyone want to round that out?
Well, one of the big changes, and we heard a little bit about this at the last meeting, is the work that VTrans is going to be undertaking under the federal law, and it's important for everybody to understand that opportunity and what it is and what it isn't. And they're going to be looking at the federal programs and evaluating them. VTrans is going to be a deep dive into VTrans programs. It's not going to be everything, at least in this first phase, that we would want it to be around cap and invest and some of those other options, because those aren't federally funded initiatives per se. So as long as we're clear-eyed about how the work that VTrans is doing will be very critical, but it's not going to answer all the questions we need. And we have some, significant work to do on these investigating the policy options that we have to undertake. And I'll pass the talking stick to others on the Transportation Subcommittee.
I mean, several of the folks that we've been working
with.
We'll
welcome questions. We'll welcome questions.
Yeah.
Liz, go ahead. I think you're first up.
Yeah, I was waiting to see if others had general comments, but I had a question on, I'm sure I have other questions as I digest it, but an immediate question that occurred to me when I was reading through this in preparation for today was in the first bullet point of the recommendations, the we recommend bullet points. I definitely get the advancing the rulemaking that's underway. Is there any more specificity that you would expect we would be bringing to the Climate Council itself regarding the rest of that bullet point, which is the setting the stage for more significant cost and carbon cutting transportation measures, like I guess it's that ensuring that legal and legislative jurisdiction exists to be ready. Is there specific legislative asks there that we're going to ask the Climate Council to support, or will we leave it that general? And I am aware of the prior legislation that was introduced when we thought TCPI might go forward. So I'm not sure if that's a version of what's contemplated or something else.
Yes, I think that is a version of something along those lines. It's essentially just continuing to, use the climate action plan as a guidepost. And I think that's an iterative conversation through the transportation task group and with you all. But that one example is, yes, what do we need to do to set the table to create an authorizing environment, that makes sense no matter what policy or regulatory direction we choose. So I think it's really, again, just continuing to make sure that we are implementing the climate action plan, and what that is, I think, to be determined, informed by ongoing conversation at the task group level, through this subcommittee, and through deeper public engagement, and then ideally maybe as a council, maybe if required through the council as a whole. But
got it.
It's not crystal clear to me. Okay. Everyone's help in clarifying, I think the goal is just to continue to make sure that this is a living, breathing tool that we implement, and that we pick the, go ahead, Gina, you
So
Well, we've been digging into filling the TCIP hole. Meanwhile, there's a lot that needs to happen in the plan, and we just want to make sure that the council and the staff are continuing to check in on what's getting done and what's not getting done. There's so much there, and our attention's is on something else, and we need to make sure the things that are in there get done somehow. Through
yeah, I guess I was probably jumping ahead to process. So it sounds like we're not expecting the subcommittee to like recommend something more specific than this memo and then have a conversation and potential vote at the Climate Council on, because I totally get the implement what we've already suggested parts that you all are mentioning. That language that I pointed to, I just wondered whether there was something more behind it. You know what I mean? Like something that we were trying to be specific about there. And if so, whether we should be clearer on that, because I don't at least understand what that would be. Just that part about legislative and legal or whatever it says, authority. Like, because I can imagine on the TCPI conversation, I got that there was this regional program that Vermont could join, and we had recommended join, and therefore needed, to put that piece in place. I'm trying to understand how we can do that prospectively, or whether we're asking for that to be done prospectively, and if so, what type of conversation that would require. That's all.
Yeah,
I'll stop.
It's so hard because there are things like mileage smart in programs that are essential to this, and we need to make sure the legislature, that's just as an example, continues to pay attention. We need to make sure we go through with the California rules, and because that's the only way we're going to get the cars here. We need to stay on that. Then there are these much bigger critical policy initiatives that are in different stages. TCIP is lurching forward, back and forth, and it's the state's participating, but it's out of our direct control. Then there's the Western Climate Initiative and a clean fuel standard, and those are deep, meaty issues that are going to require money to investigate and thoroughly vet, so that we can then move them forward. We have to do that. So in my opinion, I'm just speaking for myself here, we need to figure out how to get the resources to take those initiatives to the next level. And that's where we're going to need council approval of, yeah, this is big, this is important, and we need to start really digging into it. However that occurs. And I mean, this year we had a research proposal and we couldn't get any funding to do the work we needed to do. And now we have this money from VTrans, but it's not a perfect fit for the work we need to do to move forward. And that's me speaking. We haven't talked about that in the committee. Does anyone else? Bram, Jared, Joey?
I mean, just to sort of go back to answer your question, Liz, I have not identified, other than continuing to say we need to continue to use the climate action plan as a guidepost, and implement some of the things that make sense or set the stage for, so I don't think there's an action that we're asking the council beyond that at the moment. Because I think that some of this work needs to happen outside of this arena. In the legislative body, we're pointing in a direction. But at the same time, the broader, point, what we were trying to make in this memo is like, there's some fundamental things that we know we need to do and we should do. The way we structure our policies and programs to prioritize, use folks who drive more or who are overburdened, and then also getting the data that we need, better ongoing public engagement, and then fundamentally, as Jared just said in the chat, we know that we are likely going to have a gap with even all the unprecedented dollars that we're going to drive into programs. So we need to set the stage to do the work to identify what regulatory policy tool will deliver the certainty and the outcomes that we need. So
I would just add, Liz, the answer is no. We are not suggesting anything prospective.
So I guess I have a question on that. Is I actually had underlined that same sentence that Liz pointed out and was curious about it. And hopefully Jared will get audio soon, because I heard what Gina and Joey you were saying, and I read what's on the paper, and I feel like that's a little different than what Jared put in the chat. And just to briefly summarize, for folks who haven't seen it, I think the chat says this is a recognition that, there's, we have to do one of these two policies in order to have certainty that we'll meet our greenhouse gas reduction requirements. And those are two different things, and I think that they mean different things and would have a different reception, I think, depending on who you're presenting it to. This language, I think, is, the way I read this, it almost says, hey, if a legislation was proposed in January that said we need to join the Western Climate Initiative, or we must authorize ANR to join the Western Climate Initiative or other cap and trade as it becomes available, then there's the argument that says, hey, the Climate Council supports this. Look at this document. That's, I think, a little different than what you were saying, and saying, well, we need to make sure that we have the capability to investigate and make sure this is cost effective and right for Vermont going forward, consistent with the climate action plan and state energy policy. And so those are two slightly different things, but I think they have like a really big different impact as you go forward and we get into the practical reality of the legislative session. And so I don't know if you could, if that made sense, or if you could share a little more on kind of how you're feeling this might play out.
Well, let me just point out that the paragraph after the bold bullet states, I think, pretty clearly what Jared reiterated in the chat, which is, it says the only way to meet our emission reduction requirements will be through a cap and invest / cap and reduce and/or performance-based regulatory approach, right? So it lays out pretty clearly, we got to do one of those two things. I think the sentence below, ensuring that legal and legislative jurisdiction exists for the state to be ready for potential new economy-wide policies or regulatory programs. We could probably add just a little bit of language to clarify. If we added to the end of that sentence something like, as we decide which programs to implement, just to make it clear that the work, sort of the decisions to implement programs will require legal and legislative work to implement them. Might solve the lack of clarity that I think some people are feeling.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and to understand kind of where this is headed and what the memo says. Going back to that paragraph that you pointed out, I guess I have two questions about that paragraph that come along with that clarification. Is one, that there's nothing, one of the foundational criteria that the climate action plan and the council decided that they would evaluate programs on is cost effectiveness. And that, there's no mention of cost effectiveness in that paragraph, that it says these are, one of the two only options to go forward. And so one, I'd suggest adding that, but I'm not sure that we can add it because we don't know. I feel like we haven't done the work to know that it's cost effective. And I think what I'm really doing is pointing out a little bit of a chicken and egg thing here, because to Gina's point, we haven't had the resources and time to actually do that cost effectiveness analysis, or maybe it was Joey, you said that. But But I just get concerned because what I'm going to here is that I don't want to be in the same situation that we were last year, where the policy was put forward. There was no cost effectiveness analysis, and the policy was put forward to the public as what do you think? And it wasn't kind of built with public input, which is recognized in this memo that that's needed. But then we get to the end of the day and then nothing happens because we haven't done the work on cost effectiveness, and we haven't done the work to get the buy-in on the policy up front. And I know there's been a lot of work that's gone on in the past year on this, and so I don't want to shortchange that, but I get concerned that we're going to do all this work now, and that we're going to end up in the same exact place that we were last year in the thermal sector, where it's there's going to be a roadblock at the end, and I don't want us to go through that again. And maybe we have to, but.
I guess I would just say I don't want us to go through that again either. I don't think this is prescriptive. It just is a very generic statement, in my view, that says we're likely going to need some tool that delivers us a level of certainty, and we don't know what that is yet, but we know it's like of the ilk of one of these two things: cap and invest, cap and reduce, or performance-based standard. And this sets a directional tone for pointing to other players and partners and to ourselves that we have to do the work to deliver and inform what that actually is. I don't think that means that there's a bill that's going to be introduced that says join the Western Climate Initiative because in this January, because fundamentally we don't have a case to make that says that that's the best strategy for the state of Vermont in this moment, or that it would even be so that's not the space we're in. This is, what we're trying to do in this space of lacking, the analysis that we need, because TCIP was built on well over a decade's worth of economic analysis, insufficient, but more public engagement than anything that we've done so far on, informing what this next step is. So this is to send a point in a direction that recognizes that while we aim to strategically and equitably maximize all that these new federal funds are going to deliver, we do not have the clarity we need or the likely tool or tools in place that will deliver on the certainty that we are required to attain. So to me, to be honest with you, this is squishier than I would prefer. But with the lack of, economic analysis and, time, this sets a directional tone that says, set a process in place. And that I think process will be informed with the ongoing work of the Climate Council, but the lifting up of the Climate Office, and, the partnership with the legislature, just to acknowledge to people and to ourselves that we have a massive gap in our plan where 40% of our reductions exist. And we know that we need to do more. And this sets the tone and the stage for a process that should ensue.
And, TJ, maybe, I think what you point out is really valuable. And maybe that paragraph, should include a sentence at the end that says something about the process by which the Climate Council will decide on which of these two approaches, and within the chosen approach, which particular programs to recommend to the legislature will include a public engagement process, cost analysis, and the other key components that we will, as a council, be engaged in over the next 6 months or however long it takes us to, feel that we have everything we need from the citizens of Vermont and from the financial sector and from the science sector to be able to put forward with confidence a recommendation.
One very important point that we might be able to add is we've exhausted any options we can think of nationally, internationally. If somebody's got some other idea of how to fill this hole, please bring it on. So this is what we have. The devil will be in the details, and we have to continuously analyze and reach out, analyze some more and reach out. It's going to be iterative. It's not going to be a one and done thing, as we knew happened with TCIP. So, you know, this is the ask is we need to dive into this stuff and figure out how it's going to work for Vermont, both in terms of information analysis and public outreach and coordination. Chris?
Chris, go ahead.
One of the items I think that we do have within our control, that it's a step, it's not a big one, is that suggestion in the document about looking at the providing incentives for the heaviest users of gasoline. That's something that we can start visiting now as far as what our incentive programs are, so that you actually target the people who are using the most gas, who based on studies, and I'll post that in the chat, tend to drive the greatest distance, tend to have older vehicles, and tend to be of lower income. But by investing in those folk, by actually targeting investments in those folk, you actually you target those greenhouse gas reductions, and you tend to begin to approach some of the equity and justice concerns too. And that's something that, you know, in addition to the other larger policy things, that's something that, at least in Vermont, with regard to our own incentive programs, that's something we can actually do something about. So just in the immediate term, that's where we might be able to kind of go ahead and get some traction. I know it's not easy, it's not a slam dunk. It's going to require information about the mileage that drivers put on their vehicle or vehicles in a year. So that means you're going to have to ask them some questions. But if it's for a really significant monetary support for getting them into an EV, you know, that's sometimes we just have to provide that information, and that should be relatively easy to get, I think, just even from the inspection records, you know, that they themselves could provide. But anyway, I'll put the research in the chat. California is looking at doing this. I think, I don't know the status of their bill, but looking at reorienting their EV incentive programs.
Chris, I would be very interested in hear how you would change Mileage Smart to achieve this, because that's our flagship program right now for low and moderate income people. And how we might modify that to achieve what you're talking about. Anyway, just throwing it out there.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an excellent recommendation. What's in that second bullet, and is good for the council to really set that priority for V-Trans to respond to, and you know, by extension, other programs like Mileage Smart. Yeah, I guess going back to that other clause, I'm sorry to harp on this, but I just, do we know that these, maybe it's just the absence of the words cost effective in that paragraph, you know, that we've decided that these are the only way to meet our emissions reductions requirements is one of these two mechanisms. And one, I think it's the law is to cost effectively reduce emissions, and we don't know that yet, so cost effective has to be in there. But and what comes to mind is, you know, okay, so if we were on a trajectory of meeting our, you know, our reduction targets in 2032 as opposed to 2030, so we miss the legally obligated targets, required targets, but by meeting them in 2032, we don't set up this infrastructure that, whatever it costs, and whatever the cost of that, and then the value of moving forward the emissions reductions those 2 years, that needs to be considered as to whether we do this or not, and whether it is the way that we meet our emissions reductions targets. And I just, as long as this leaves space for that kind of look, and I don't want to say we want to aim to miss our targets, but we have to, if it's not cost effective to actually meet them in year one, and we meet it a year later, like, what does that mean for the state? What does that mean for Vermonters? And what does it mean in terms of our carbon reductions? And we have a value by which to evaluate that on, in the social cost of carbon. And so we can say, here's the value of those emissions 2 years earlier. And if it's not cost effective, and tell me if that's not the correct proper metric by which to evaluate. But if it's not cost effective, then it raises into, well, should we continue to use the carrot approach and the federal money that's coming in, and adding state money, and encouraging reductions in VMT, and without kind of this overarching umbrella? I'm struggling with that, and I'm worried that this language boxes us into, we must go forward with one of these two options. Now, you guys are telling me that it doesn't box us in, and so
Well,
I just, when I look at the language, I see it different.
I would say it doesn't box us in, it lays out the reality, right? The reality is we have to do one of these two. As Gina said, we have beat the bushes nationally and globally, and it does not appear that there is any other way to meet our required emissions reductions. We have to do one of these two. So let's assume for a second that that's our reality, right? The only way to get there, as the law requires, is to take one of these two paths. Certainly, we want to get equal emissions reductions at the lowest possible cost. Check. And I think, it's also certainly true that if we could get there in 2032 for $1 million, or in 2030 for $50 million, we would take 2032 for $1 million. I would balance that by quoting Bill McKibben, who said, winning slowly on climate change is the same as losing. Right there. And, we have a cost benefit analysis of the whole program, which said over the next, 30 years, Vermonters win by a net of whatever it was, $6 billion or something, right? These things are hard to calculate. And I think, the analyses, and we have to, that's what we have to rely on. But I think we want to keep in mind that we probably understate the cost to future humans of emissions, and we probably understate the benefit to future humans of reducing emissions. These things are just like, it's how many cases of cancer, how much human suffering, all that stuff, right? And how much disruption to agriculture, and how much hunger, and all those things. But we have an analysis, we have numbers, and I think we absolutely need to be explicit in this memo that being cost effective, getting there in the most cost effective way is, absolutely a requirement.
So, I agree. And I guess, TJ, I appreciate your point. And I think one of the things that I was thinking of, and I'm happy to add, have the words cost effective added in there, because I think what our thought was, we applied, our screen in general for all of our recommendations is that 5-pronged screen of greenhouse gas emission reductions, cost effectiveness, equity, technical feasibility, and something else really important that I'm
Co-benefits.
Thank you. But I just note that to say that for me, it was implied but not explicit. If we want to make it explicit, to say, clearly we want, a cost-effective program, but we want, programs and, policies that point in the direction of meeting our legal obligations. And And if in, 3 years or whatever, we recognize, oh, we're so far ahead, we can realign. But I think this is intended to send a direction that, and I'm a little bit struggling with this conversation because we're sort of interchanging, the bullets, like with that have some very concrete things with like this overarching recommendation. So one thing I wonder about is, can we separate those two things and just talk about, do people generally support the 4 different bullets under the primary one, the first one? And because I think those are concrete, and I don't hear any, unless people have not expressed some concerns with that directionally, those seem right to people. It would just be helpful to me to like focus on one conversation instead of interchanging them. And because it seems like the concern, and maybe, for lack of a better term, the controversy is in the first bullet. Fundamentally, the other bullets seem right. We should strategically design programs to, target the heaviest, oil, gasoline users first and prioritize equity. We should get the data we need. We should do better public engagement and ongoing public engagement. And we should continue to implement the plan, but then, so does that seem right? Can we separate the conversation? if that's okay with folks, and maybe start with the 4 bullets first and then go back to the overarching one? Liz, bring us home.
I generally think the 4 bullets are right. And my suggestion might be to, as you kind of consider further tweaks to the draft, really simplifying those 4 bullets to maybe shorten, bold, make them real clear. Like the first one is do everything we already said we needed to do. Second one is the proportion to users in terms of incentives and programs, et cetera. I think that might help some of the conversation that we've been having if the memo were structured that way. And on the incentives and programs, I just think I would consider at least adding more explicitly the point that Chris and I were chatting about in chat, that it's not just the customer incentives, but the infrastructure to support it. If we're going to do what we're talking about in that bullet, there might need to be some realignment of how we think about our infrastructure too, which, understandably at this point has been corridors and downtowns. Of course, we need it everywhere, but if we're going to realign to get the most impact, we need to include that.
Really quickly before Chris, you offer something thoughtful, I'm sure. I appreciate that, Liz. Those are good recommendations. And a logistical question for Marion. Marion, are you taking notes?
I am taking minutes. I doubt they are.
I just was wondering if we could, we can revisit. That was some helpful concrete input. And when we deliver a second draft, I can try to make sure that my brain can articulate that. But if to the degree you're able to capture any specificity, Marion, that'd be helpful. And I will now be prepared to do the same. Chris, take it away.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, I don't know the research on this, and I'm not at all, and this assumption may be completely inaccurate, but I do think, I'm curious that if, and looking at other states too, if, to the extent they're considering this, if you really were to target the heaviest users of gasoline and you look at the data that indicates they tend to be more rural, they tend to be lower income, education wise, and otherwise they tend not to be different from the rest of the population. It might promote a faster cultural shift too, if we actually, and to Liz's point about also making that investment in the infrastructure, a lot of cases be at the homes or elsewhere in rural areas, we'd want to kind of play this out. What does that look like? It might help facilitate a greater cultural shift too. I mean, I'll just say, for a big part of my life, especially as a young man, a lot of my lifestyle and time, energy, and money went into my cars. I mean, I was racing on weekends, and I was building cars. I was very much a gearhead, and to some extent, like other aspects of our lives, this also goes into cultural identity. So it's not just it's not just like a basic rational choice calculus about what do I drive to, to get from point A to point B is also, really tied sometimes to who people are. And if we really did make it easier for the heavier users to make that switch, it might be possible that, within groups of people that, within peer groups, you'll see, oh, okay, this isn't that bad. It's not the end of the world. They're not running out of power. They're not running out of fuel. Before they can even get home from work, they're able to continue on just like they were before. And the torque is really nice too. And the other crazy things that electronic vehicles let you do as far as ride and height and all kinds of other adjustments, it might help with that shift. So just want to put that out there. I'm sure somebody has begun to kind of do some research on that, but especially in our rural state, and for us to try to get some traction there, revisiting our incentives might make a difference. So Gina's question before, I went back and looked at the mileage smart, and it doesn't tie to, the amount of energy consumed, unless I'm just missing something. And I know I don't think this is a magic snap of the fingers. The legislature is going to love it. It's going to be an easy thing to do, but I definitely think it's a conversation worth having in the state, and frankly, with the broader public. What do they think about that kind of policy? Because it might begin to, address some of the fears that are out there about what happens as EVs become more the standard. Dodge just announced yesterday they're no longer going to sell the Challenger and the Charger. My first car was a 72 Dodge Challenger. Love that thing. Still dream about it. But the world is changing, whether Vermont likes it or not, and we need to kind of, do what we can to be prepared for the delivery of these new vehicles and the whole new structure that implies for everybody.
Thanks for that, Chris. I mean, to my mind, those last. Oh, Christine, were you trying to say something?
Would this be an okay time, TJ?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, to answer Joey's question, yes, I support the bottom 4 bullets. Yes, I support the simplification of those 4 bottom bullets as suggested by Liz, possibly having one sentence for each bullet that's the ask, and then having that background material below it. On the top bullet, it reads to me that it's intentionally veiled, and I can understand the thinking that might have led to that decision. I wish it were a direct ask that the resources be found urgently and quickly to do a full analysis of what the impacts in greenhouse gas reductions and the ability to deliver a cost-effective program would be if we pursued cap and invest in Vermont, or instead if we pursued a performance-based standard. That's what I would prefer it to say, but it may be that we know the conversation, it's too early in the process to have that specific and direct an ask, and that we need to go the more general approach at this point in time. I don't have the inside knowledge to know which judgment to make, but that's my thinking about the top bullet as well as the 4 bottom.
Thanks, Christine. I will note that our in about 45 minutes, we'll talk about our budget priorities going forward, and there may be an opportunity to bring in what you're talking about there into that conversation and move that forward in the next couple of months with a recommendation on budget. So let's hold on that one for a second. And then I was just going to say that, again, I'm trying to, my purpose in bringing kind of some of these issues up was to look at it with fresh eyes and kind of anticipate some of the process issues that might arise if this kind of, depending on how this plays out. And so the 4 bullets, I think, as revised and with the clarifications, I think are good. And that additional paragraph, we talked about some modifications there. I think that would be helpful as well. Before we solidify next steps, I'd want to do 2 things. One is to just ask if anybody else on the committee has comments, but then I'll let the public, anybody from the public chime in on this before we actually decide what to do, so that we can get their input. Is there any other comment from subcommittee members or state staff? Okay. Hearing none, I want to open the floor to public comment on this, and see if there's anybody from the public that wants to comment. Hey, George, I think you'd be good on Jeopardy, George. Your hand is, you get your hand up really quickly.
Yes, this is as soon as I know the answer. I'll take random climate change questions for $100. Okay. So I guess when I read through the recommendations, candidly, I was hoping to see something a little more concrete. To TJ's point, which I think I have to agree with, if the governor at the end of the day doesn't feel comfortable with the level of, like what I want to call due diligence about the economic aspects of things, since that is important to him and I guess to many in the state, it's obvious that this committee, this group, has to roll up their sleeves and hire some entity that has the expertise to do that type of modeling exercise and bring it into the package of things that support whatever you ultimately end up choosing. And ideally, given cap and trade and cap and invest are likely to increase costs of the fuels, whether it be gasoline or heating oil, you would probably do well to have surrounding states on board as well simultaneously, so you minimize the opportunity for leakage to other states because they have a lower cost. So I would approach, if I was looking at this problem, our peers, whoever they might be in Massachusetts, in New York specifically, maybe even New Hampshire, though they're a little less progressive on these topics, and try and find common ground just in that small circle of neighboring states. And with that, if you have an alliance that shows up as carrying a common theme for all 3 states, I think you'll have made a significant move towards solving your problem. But to do that, I think, as you've just alluded to, your budget exercise needs to incorporate a planning process that isn't currently funded and needs head on this economic issue, which people consider so important. Hope that helps. Thanks.
Thanks, George. Before you disappear completely, are you suggesting that the study also include kind of how to include the neighboring states and what the impacts would be with varying levels of participation, or is that right?
So I don't know. The governor of our state is in contact with the governors of the peer states on a regular basis, but ultimately it would be one of those things where organizations like the Climate Council talk to whatever's analogous to a Climate Council of New York and Massachusetts to broker some form of a framework that everybody likes and gets each respective governor to ultimately be on board with. And have enough substantiating economic data that each of the parties is satisfied that it's the right direction ahead. I think the climate heat, the clean heat standard, obviously is a cautionary tale. I had ambivalent feelings about, frankly, because of some of the defects I perceived in it. But that set aside, I mean, we do need something like that or WCI. I'm kind of agnostic of which one. It's just really the economic study might actually help you understand which one does better, if that's possible. And yeah, it's about getting an alliance if you want it to scale. And I guess what you have to do is in this recommendation to the Climate Council, ask for the authority to negotiate and open a conversation with these peers and open a conversation or an RFP for the economic study.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, George. I appreciate the comment and the input there as we think about how to go forward. And that again will come back up in the budgeting request. I also just want to acknowledge the comment in the chat in terms of cost. I think about cost as net cost, but it doesn't come out that way. And so, Jared, you mentioned the one-sided cost. I think you're exactly right, and that's a terminology kind of standard that we need to do better on to really talk about this the right way. I think it's really impact and how the benefits and costs net, and then the next step is impact to whom as well. So thank you for pointing that out. I'm just trying to catch up on the chat as well. And I realize I'm not going to be able to do that on the fly. Are there any other comments or things people want to bring forward before we
well, appreciating the comments. Thank you, George, for your comments, Christine too. And I also just to note that, yes, we can go back and take a stab at that being clear in the 4-bullet summary. Want to make sure that there's nothing else more concrete that is missing. I think that, our analysis is those 4 steps are fundamental, like sort of like foundational, and this is what we should do. And again, as Jared is articulating in the chat, and we tried to be clear, that even it's highly likely we need a level of certainty that we cannot rely on at this moment. And so the fundamental overarching, sort of directional, squishy recognition that we need a cap and invest or likely a performance-based standard. I would like it to be more specific to George. I just fundamentally don't think we have the sufficient information that we need to choose one approach over the other, nor have we done the due diligence again that they spent over a decade doing in Transportation and Climate Initiative. So it's meant to be directional, and I think a suite of strategies and next steps, and that there's more work to be done to analyze exactly what and how, and certainly we would want it to be cost effective. So people are dropping. I will defer to you on process, TJ. But it is my hope that this sort of general recommendation sets the right tone and is the right sort of compilation of strategies that we want to recommend. I mean, I think without the first bulleted recommendation, I think that I would not feel certain that we are going to deliver on our legal and moral obligation. So even though it is not as concrete as we would like it to be for the reasons we've articulated earlier.
Yeah, I think with those clarifications, I think that would be useful. I think we're heading towards another committee meeting in a couple of weeks, actually. Hopefully we can fit it into everybody's schedules, given the council meeting and the budget priority need. So there may be another opportunity to, if the task group can revise kind of pursuant to the conversation today, that we can have a much shorter conversation based on the changes made at the next subcommittee meeting, which I think would probably be first week in September, or sometime before the 12th of September.
That'd be great. And I guess we can take a stab at that. At the same time, I would invite you, especially anyone with a very specific, clear-eyed view of what you would like to see words on the page, to redline a draft and send it to Gina and I. And I'll work with we can work with the transportation task group to refine based on the input today. But I would ask anyone with very specific, what they would like to see, to send that input directly to us. That'd be great.
Can I just chime in for just a couple of minutes, just to make sure everybody kind of understands certain things that are in the works that I'm just not sure everybody's aware of. Gina, I don't know, I think your question was to me after I made my comment, recognizing that VTrans is doing an optimization analysis on our incentive programs this year. So that will be included in a report at the end of the year. And sorry, I didn't recognize this earlier as this was being developed, but that second bullet is sort of prescriptive. And I'm not sure that it should be, because who knows what that optimization is going to tell us. I think, that is a good point and something that we should be considering in optimizing the incentives, but maybe that's not what should happen. So I just put that out there for some thought. And then the other thing I wanted to make sure folks are aware of is our carbon reduction strategy, the CRS, and where we'll be with that. We have phase 2 being completed by around September, October next year, which will develop scenarios of cost-effective scenarios for reducing emissions from the transportation sector. It will talk about what AOT is able to do with its programs, but specifically, one of the scenarios has to leave out AOT programs and look at policies. So I can't imagine, there's many people on this call even that will be part of our technical committee and our advisory committee for that strategy. So they will have input to what those policies might be analyzing. Can't imagine that would, not include a cap and invest or a performance standard. And so I can't tell you right now exactly what we're going to get out of that and what level of detail the economic analysis or the cost efficiency will go into, but I just want people to recognize that that is part of what we're looking at. So I can take questions on any of that, or just.
Andrea, did you say end of the calendar year? What's the time frame?
So the phase 1 is just doing an analysis and an evaluation of what our programs do for emissions, and then phase 2 starts in January, ends. It's due to Federal Highway in November, so our contract with our consultant says we need a report somewhere September, October timeframe. So yeah.
So next year, got it.
Yeah, next year, 2023. Yep.
Okay, so I think we have a plan forward. Thank you for those clarifications, Andrea. That's helpful. And I think so just to reiterate, make sure everybody heard the same thing I did, that folks will email any suggestions to Joey and Gina in the next several days. The task group, actually, I think your task group meets on Mondays, so hopefully before Monday. Email any suggested language, and then the task group will try and revise the document as discussed, and we'll by the end of this meeting have another cross-sector meeting scheduled where we can review those revisions, but hopefully narrow the discussion to just confirming that the revisions are in line with our discussion. Okay. Thank you for that discussion, and thank you for all the work that has gone into this. I know you have been meeting very regularly and working hard on this. It's much appreciated. So let's transition to the thermal sector request for proposals. I think last time we all met as a group, as the cross-sector mitigation committee, we had talked about and supported the issuance of a letter to the relevant administrative and legislative bodies requesting funding for to do the analysis on cost effectiveness and to do the public engagement on the thermal sector related to a sector-wide standard for the thermal sector, building standard. And so like the clean heat standard. Since then, I don't think the letter ultimately was ever sent, but the impact of that, the practical outcome was the same. The Agency of Natural Resources has looked under the couch cushions and found some resources to issue a request for proposal and run that process. The agency, in coordination with the department, my office, has been developing a draft request for proposals. And the proposal here today is for either the building's thermal task group or some different composition of a task group to review the scope of work of that RFP and then provide feedback and move it forward. The RFP is just about ready to be released. As I understand it, I think by next Wednesday, we'll be able to send it to the task group, a draft of the scope of work in particular. It probably will have all the state terms and conditions, but you all shouldn't focus on that. And then the task group could review and make recommendations. We could either authorize that task group to kind of make recommendations on behalf of the committee, or we could bring it back to the full subcommittee, and we'll leave that up for discussion. But I think that's the status of it, and we should probably talk about the process and the task group composition. I gave a really high-level summary of what has happened with that letter, and but the really relevant fact is that there's money available to do the analysis on cost-benefit analysis and public engagement.
This is Christine. Would now be an appropriate time to respond, PJ?
Sure. Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah. I think I'm a member of the thermal task group, and speaking just for myself, I'd be happy to review the scope of work and the proposed RFP. I'd also love to renegotiate the state's T&Cs, but I'm just kidding about that. I'd also be happy to review proposals if later down the pike, if that would be helpful. I served in those roles with Jane and Jared back when we were developing the RFP for what led to be the mitigation work that Cadmus and EFG did. So if it's helpful, I'd be happy to serve those roles.
Great. Thank you, Christine. Dave, you had your hand up, but I'm not sure if you withdrew it on purpose.
I was trying to draw it faster than George, but I didn't do that to any effect. No, I just want to chime in what Christine just said. I'm happy to help along with that as well. And I was just curious, do you have a time next Wednesday for a draft being available? What are you envisioning for a turnaround time for the review?
Ideally, the we'll get this RFP out as soon as possible, but I'm not sure that we have a specific turnaround time. Let me look at a calendar. I think probably within a week at the most. I don't know, Brian, do you have a thought on that?
Only that that's informed by whether or not this comes back to cross-sector mitigation, as you mentioned. And
right.
So if that's required, then it's going to be, probably in mid-September. But you're exactly right. The intent is to move this through the task group. And then, if cross-sector would like to review, but a meeting's not required, then, probably early in September would be when the RFP would go out. If there's a meeting that's involved, then you're probably looking at the middle of September.
Right, and just to be clear for folks, I think we're going to need a cross-sector mitigation committee meeting in sometime before the 12th, before the next council meeting. And so if it were to come back to this cross-sector mitigation committee, then the task group would need to review in time to provide that feedback to that committee, to this committee. So I guess, so Dave and Christine have volunteered. I don't know if the thermal task group was bigger than the two of you last year or throughout the course of the last 18 months. Is there anybody else that really wants to participate in reviewing the scope of work for the RFP?
TJ, I think Rich Cowart has indicated he would like to be involved with this based on an email he sent to Dave and me, but Dave might have interpreted that differently than I, and I can't pull it up right now because I'm in the car.
And it appears that Jared would as well, if you find his comment in the chat.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll reach out to Rich to confirm that. Thanks, Christine, and thanks, Jared and Dave, to volunteering to be on the group. I think the next question is related to setting the deadlines. And does the cross-sector mitigation committee want to see the scope of work, the RFP, as informed by the task group before the RFP goes out? The other option is to authorize the task group to make that decision on behalf of the committee.
TJ, while the group is considering that, I think maybe this is a good time to point out, or there's this, the latest iteration of it includes analysis of not only the clean heat standard, but a number of options in the thermal sector. And the idea is to be able to provide, analysis of more than one path forward, and to be able to compare one versus another. So it includes the, sector-wide performance standards like the clean heat standard or clean fuel standard, like we were talking about in transportation. But it also includes expansion of existing policies and programs. It includes a direct carbon pollution pricing, or like a price on carbon, cap and invest in the thermal sector, and then targeted performance standards for heating appliances, or direct regulation of fuel emissions or appliances as well. So it's not specific to clean heat. So it's going to be a very comprehensive analysis. And the idea is that with the assistance of the contractor, they could look at those proposals and or combinations of them that achieve the reductions that are required proportionally. They're calculated proportional reductions in the thermal sector to support the achievement of the 2030, the 2025 and 2030 reductions.
Thanks for
Brian, I have a question. Has consideration been given to including economy-wide cap and invest in this analysis? I understand how we got to thinking about this at the thermal sector level, but informed by the conversation we just had, and is there a rationale for broadening it to be looking at these various options at an economy-wide level, not only the thermal sector, but including the thermal sector as well as transportation?
Well, do I think that's a good idea, or is that what the process has been, as TJ described, that this came out of a request by the group to address questions, from the executive and others about what would this exactly cost and provide more details, and this being the clean heat standard. It's expanded as far as what the options would be to reduce emissions in the thermal sector. But the task that the group has been working on, the internal group, has been focused on the thermal sector. Certainly that's a legitimate question about, whether or not an economy-wide evaluation is appropriate. And as part of the background for this, the JFO commissioned those decarbonization report, and we went back to that RFF report where they talked about, economy-wide measures or measures in multiple sectors in order to be able to achieve particular reduction standards. And that was a great report to review, because it showed that there are very competent contractors that can do a very detailed policy and economic analysis of these types of policies. So a long way of saying is the focus has been on the buildings and thermal sector here, and specifically regarding the residential, commercial, industrial sector, because that's the way it's described in the inventory, and that's how we're developing the target. But I will leave it to the group at large, and TJ can facilitate that conversation regarding whether or not a broader look is appropriate at this time, and with this particular funding.
Thanks, Brian. Dave, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, TJ. So with respect to the two options about how to proceed here, I personally, and I think probably the group is really interested in seeing this move forward quickly, but I think depending on when the next meeting is scheduled, I think it would be sort of in broader interest of the public to be able to have a chance for the public to take a look at this before it's finalized, to kick the tires on it. So depending on when that next meeting is scheduled, getting what we think is a good draft out so folks can comment on it at that next meeting. I think that's a good way to proceed.
Okay, any other thoughts on the process that folks want to share? So it sounds like, let me say, are there any objections to what Dave has proposed? And I do think it would be that week that Labor Day falls in is the week that we would need to hold that meeting. So for the cross-sector mitigation committee, so that gives a week for task group review, and then meet and have a final product within another week. Okay, our next meeting is shaping up to be busy also. Thank you all for that. That's helpful in terms of process. Any other comment on the RFP? Okay, So next up on the agenda, right on time, is update on the biomass task group. And I think I'm going to turn it to Liz, if you don't mind, to share an update.
Sure, happy to, and we might gain a few minutes potentially. This the Biomass Task Group has met a number of times over the summer. I did miss one of the meetings due to vacation, but caught up on the materials. And I guess, you know, the best way to frame the work so far, we are still getting educated. We've had a number of presentations rather, both from the science community as well as more recently from representatives of the operating electric biomass plants in Vermont. We've discussed air quality, water quality, emissions generally from a greenhouse gas point of view, forestry practices, and a number of other things. And the goal overall that I believe the task group has agreed to and coalesced around is to be able to bring something back to the Climate Council, I believe for the October meeting, not the September meeting. Jane, who has been primary staff support for the subcommittee, has been working on narrowing as we go along where those updated recommendations could actually achieve consensus and where they might not. And I think it's fair to say we don't yet have a sense from the whole group where that will land or whether there will be a consensus set of recommendations out of it. But I can say, as somebody who's participated in the meetings and reviewed the materials so far, it is a large set of material. And while I'm definitely aware as a non-expert in this area that there's far more to be learned and that can be learned, I do feel like the subgroup has taken very seriously the task of hearing from a number of different areas. Having said that, there are a few more that I know they're looking to schedule. So there will be further work between now and October. And I think it would probably be important, TJ, at our next subcommittee meeting to just put maybe another 3 to 5 minute update on so that we can, at that point, know whether some of the learning meetings have turned more concretely to action and recommendations, or whether there will be a different outcome in terms of, you know, seeking more time or more information, that sort of thing. That part's TBT. Questions or anything? TJ, I know you've attended some in the past, like anything else those who have attended want to add in terms of where we are now?
For my part, I stepped off in the spring, so I haven't been quite as engaged in that committee. And unfortunately, Adam had to leave today's meeting. But yeah, I guess I will point out too that we're going to schedule this new meeting, which I keep alluding to, and then we have another meeting. It's the end of September already scheduled, and so I think your process of bringing this up in a couple of weeks to see where we're at and the likelihood of there being recommendations or what, it's just kind of setting the stage for in that late September meeting.
Yes.
Okay, this is what we're going to present to the council in October.
Yeah, climate council as a whole. I think the idea would be not unlike the transportation subcommittee, if it's possible to coalesce around a set of recommendations and principles that can be brought to the Climate Council as a piece from the prior plan that was, kind of not put in place because that work had not yet been done. That would be great. So we should know in that time frame whether that's possible. And I know there's also a number of folks, I think, who are attending the meeting today who've attended some of those. So I'm sure if we do have further public comment, they may have comments as well, but I'll otherwise leave it there.
Great, thanks, Liz. And let's open it up now for while we're on the subject. If not only council or subcommittee members, but if members of the public wanted to add anything about the biomass task group and direction for this committee, please speak up. Hi, Annette.
Hello, I'll weigh in a little. I've been attending the meetings. There have been a number of presentations given that I have commented in public comment. I haven't really found to be very helpful. Most of the presentations have been almost put together in a way as to minimize or show there aren't any issues rather than focusing on what the issues are. And it's almost entirely been about the health effects and the harvesting practices for McNeil and Rygate biomass. I don't learn a lot. Things like, where's all the wood come from? How much of it comes from New York? How much comes from New York? What are their harvesting practices compared to Vermont? I mean, we're just not getting a lot of detail. The emissions issue information that was given was put in percentages compared to wood burning stoves rather than actual information. So I'm not sure where this is going. And since this it's only talking about electric generation, it's not talking about biofuels. I don't know. It's been a very challenging subcommittee. It's not very well balanced. There's a lot of state agency people, and so between attendance issues and the makeup of the subcommittee, as a member of the public watching it, it's just been rather difficult. So that's my report on it.
Thanks, Annette. I think so. When I had left that task group, the discussion was heading towards prioritizing electric generation, but then kind of in stages going from electric generation and then getting into biofuels in the discussion and kind of some of that broader context. Is that still the path forward?
Yeah, I think what happened there, TJ, is because of some of the other recommendations in the Climate Council on the thermal side and the initial charge of the Climate Council to the subcommittee, Annette's absolutely right that it's been focusing on electric biomass. And there are many discussions about whether to broaden that. And you're essentially right that the decision, and I think this was even discussed at the Climate Council, was, well, keep it to electric generation, given that that was the initial charge with regard to the tabled amendments, as well as the piece that wasn't covered by thermal. But that wouldn't foreclose later examination of any other issues, including biofuels more generally. I think, at least from my perspective, which of course I recognize to Annette's point, I represent the utility sector. We, among others, are part owners of the McNeil plant. So, obviously that's a particular perspective that's electric biomass focused. At least from where I was sitting, that felt like the place where there was a possibility of some consensus with regard to, whether there would be ever support for, say, new generation versus thinking through how currently operating plants, continue their operations. So I'm not sure if that's where the subcommittee will go. But anyway, in short, you're right that it is limited to electric generation. And I believe in the end, that was confirmed through conversations with the Climate Council and doesn't preclude work down the road, but not this fall.
Thanks for that, Liz. And I have one other question on that, is just, it strikes me to get to maybe Annette's point on the data, has there been kind of a list made of, here are the data needs that we need to make these decisions? Or it seems like as we go forward, and I raise that thinking about our budget discussions that are coming up, and just the process going forward, the recommendation could be, we need resources to get this data that has not been presented to us, and so that we can kind of raise up that data so everybody's on the same page and get the real numbers out there to make
I'd be
decisions.
happy. Yeah, I'd be happy to bring that back to the subcommittee specifically, like the specific thing you just said of, hey, is there something that we should be raising up as a subgroup to the Climate Council for further data analysis? And if so, now's the time to do it for this kind of coming cycle. So I'll definitely do that. At this point, a lot of conversation in terms of what types of folks we wanted to hear from, what types of presentations and information we needed, but I can't say that there's sort of a single list of remaining items that there's consensus around need. And I don't think it's been framed in the way you just said, in terms of, hey, is there any piece that would actually be, you know, like a funded study or a next step? So I'll bring that up.
Great, thank you. George, if you could just hang on a second, I feel it, Annette, if you're going to respond to that specific question, I think it might be useful for you to go next again.
Yeah, there have been responses to my data requests that have indicated that they would be provided, but since I'm not on the task group, I don't know that it's happened. And the next thing that I am aware of where the discussion is taking place is trying to pull together a session where you hear, where the task group hears directly from people who live around the McNeil biomass plant to hear what the issues are associated with it, because we really haven't heard anything about that. And so I think that that's something, I mean, honestly, most of the time of this subgroup has been spent trying to figure out what not to talk about rather than actually talking about it. And so
That's fair, Annette.
From my perspective, I wasted a lot of time, and so has everybody else. And it would have been, we could have learned a whole lot more and had a much broader array of speakers that really would have helped inform the topic. But at this point, I'm sure everybody feels like they're running out of time. And so I don't know what is ever going to come together out of this, but I do think that there is some effort to form even a subgroup to try and come up with some recommendations to bring to the subcommittee or the task group.
Great, thank you. Hopefully we can, that can move forward in the next couple of months. Sometimes the time pressure is what's needed to make something happen. So, George, thank you for waiting. You were slower on the Jeopardy buzzer that time. So. And you're even slower on the mute button buzzer. So you're on mute still.
All right, there you go.
There you go.
Yeah, biomass is a little harder to figure out what to say because candidly, this idea that you can, in the current climate system, put more carbon dioxide into the air between now and 2050, which is our drop dead date. Actually, probably sooner than that, if you believe some of the things I'm reading. This idea you'd use it to generate electricity is really madness. If you look at the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide that those plants have put into the air, that carbon dioxide still up there. And the forests will slowly maybe get it, if they stay healthy enough, over the next century or so. Even in the most optimistic studies that the group has seen from scientists who've studied this issue, harvesting practices that use green trees, whole green trees as part of the biomass, made no sense at all. Because the emissions weren't recovered in time. We'll run over the red line in our climate system long before that. So the real issue that the biomass group is grappling with, frankly, is how to stop something that's profitable. And I don't know how people get the political will to do the right thing in the climate arena, but again and again, this is a theme I have seen across multiple sectors and multiple facets of this problem. And as long as we are beholden to the economic interests and what preferences those have, the climate systems work is going to be hobbled and won't succeed in time for what we know is a really harsh landing once things get going. And we're seeing that. I mean, I was looking at the thermometer last week. It was 98 degrees, folks, in the shade. So I don't know what it takes to get this resolved to stop emitting carbon dioxide. The biomass generation of electricity is a good example of a profitable fall solution. Just speaking on my perspective, which is, I think, supported by science, for what that's worth.
Well, thank you for those comments. And there's some bigger issues there that you brought up that I don't know that we have time to address all of them right now. And hopefully the biomass group can kind of dive into those. I guess I'm going to leave it at that, given the time, though. But I appreciate that comment. Okay, I'm going to move on to our last substantive topic here before we schedule our next meeting. Hopefully nobody else has to drop off, because it would be good to schedule that with as many people here as possible. But the topic is related to budget priorities and the September council meeting. And so at the steering committee meeting, there was an acknowledgement that that last year we kind of ran out of time, and the times didn't line up from when the climate action plan was ready, and then the climate council might be able to make budget recommendations to when the budget, the administration's budget anyway, needs to be prepared. And ultimately that date lines up roughly with the October council meeting, in that I think that's October 17th maybe is the council meeting, that any recommendations from the council would need to be agreed upon by the council and then submitted shortly thereafter to the administration for consideration and inclusion in the budget process. Doesn't mean they would definitely get in, but to be considered. And I alluded to that a couple of times. But so what that means really is that any initial recommendations and thinking on things that the council might want to include in such a recommendation needs to be really at least raised and highlighted at least at a high level at the September council meeting, so that they're not just seeing it for the first time in October, because we kind of know how things go when people see things for the first time and then are required to make a decision on it. It makes it a lot harder. And so we talked a little bit about potential items for budget recommendations, and I think the process that well, at least that Jane has recommended, I think that was a steering committee recommendation, was that the subcommittees get together before the September council meeting and try to come up with budget priorities. And these could kind of come in two buckets, I think. One bucket is the resources, the administrative, technical, legal resources that the Climate Council might need, that the subcommittees might need to kind of carry out its work. Those are some of the things we talked about earlier today. And then there's kind of the bucket of money to devote to actual implementation of the plan, like incentives or well, I'll just leave it at incentives because I can't think of another good example off the top of my head. But it's that kind of be the other bucket of items. So I kept, if we do meet in the first week of September, I think that would be a main topic item, but we probably need a group to start thinking about this ahead of that meeting to bring some ideas to this subcommittee. I'm gonna stop there, and for other people who were at the steering committee meeting may be able to flesh out or provide a little more context on what I said if needed.
I was there and I thought you hit it. I mean, it would be great if just thinking through, especially the kind of task groups that are feeding into our subcommittees. So transportation, thermal, biomass, as you raised a second ago. Yeah, we have a few things that are pretty concrete, just thinking about the next budget cycle, you know, because we have all these big things, but, you know, to Gina's point earlier, we know there's certain things that just haven't kind of crossed the finish line on funding. Do we have a set of those that we want to specifically put on the table at the Climate Council for priority for funding this coming year? So I think that is consistent with what you said.
So how to best go about that? I guess we could, you know, is there a representative of each of those task groups? Should they get together? Should it be, you know, a different group, or just the task groups themselves and make recommendations for ahead of our next meeting? Folks have ideas on the best process.
TJ, before you do that, maybe we need Jane or Marion to answer this question. What about where there's overlap with just transitions and outreach and communication and public input? I think there's a lot of need there. And so how does cross-sector interact with what's going on in just transitions or other committees?
Well, Just Transitions is meeting today and has an agenda item to start thinking about these budget priorities from their perspective.
Okay.
I mean, I think
we may have needs I know we have needs in those areas.
Sure. So I think, I mean, one great resource is Kelly, who is on your subcommittee and is a liaison to the Just Transition subcommittee. So ensuring that she is cued in to think through how those recommendations intersect, and perhaps there's some ideas that you may want to flag for Kelly today that she can think about this evening. I think then it, you know, the subcommittees will be bringing those recommendations to the council, and it's up to the council to decide what to then recommend to the administration for inclusion in the budget process. So it will be a role for councilors to then weigh where those overlap and what sort of makes sense to include in those budget recommendations.
Sorry, TJ, go on with your request.
No, thank you. That's a really good point. And yeah, I think at least, you know, I think we've identified that there's going to be efforts needed in the transportation and thermal sectors at a minimum. And so hopefully Just Transitions will identify that. You know, the department is also undergoing an effort on the electric side as well, where that coordination with the council and moving forward could potentially use resources. You know, that we've already made an administration priority, so we're going to move something forward. It's just the level of which we do it at could be informed by any additional resources that the council recommends.
PJ, this is Christine. Would now be an appropriate time to make?
Yes, please go ahead.
This isn't going to be helpful in the short term, but because this is a fast-moving need. But from where I sit, and maybe I'm unique in this, I don't have a good understanding off the top of my head of which of the thermal, let's just focus on thermal sector since that's the task group I'm on. I don't have a good understanding in my head on which of the thermal recommendations that were included in the climate action plan are actually moving forward through the existing state government process and which are not, and therefore where there are gaps in what ought to be being achieved over the next year. And so therefore, what resources would be needed, what types of resources and capacity would be needed to fill the gaps where action is not moving forward that should have been. So I don't really feel I have an informed frame for answering your question. And I know there's not a way to fix that between now and the dates you just laid out, but I just wanted to share that observation. And maybe everybody else does know which actions are being made for whichever sector they're in, and therefore what the gaps are. But I don't have that view from where I sit.
Yeah, that brings up a really good point, is that, I know, so we're Department of Public Service, you're bringing this in my frame, I apologize for that, but we have an annual energy report that we do each year, and part of that report, we take the comprehensive energy plan requirements and say, or recommendations, and say, here's the progress that was made on these, and or if none, here's the plan. And so it strikes me that I'm not sure that that exists for the climate action plan, that there's nobody kind of responsible for kind of checking in and providing a, even just a matrix of here is the recommendation, and or taking those tables that were in the plan and saying, here's the progress on it, or here's what's happened. And that could be a very useful tool going forward.
Yes, and that is what I suspected, but I wasn't sure. And I would say that that's an urgent issue that somebody needs to be held, charged with fixing before we go through another year. I understand it's not going to get fixed in the next month, but I would really like to hear back through this subcommittee within the next month or so that function has been identified as a gap that needs to be filled within the state system, and that steps are being taken to provide some sort of organized annual reporting on the recommended progress or not, and the plan for making progress on the recommendations that are in the climate action plan. Please.
Yeah, I think we can do if nobody from the agency and natural resources or climate office has that kind of now. I will circle back with them and see if how we can move something like that forward. Joey, go ahead.
No, I think it's great suggestion and appreciate you looking into it, TJ. And a little bit related for me is sort of it may not be clear yet, but a reminder for folks of like, what is the climate office? What's the role and the function, the focus of the climate office, and how that at this point interfaces with our work, and or how it could be helpful as that effort gets lifted. Maybe helpful. So I just want to support the recommendation, and also just ask the question, and maybe just to get an update on the climate office might be useful.
I can just add to that, Joey, at the steering committee meeting on Monday, it was tangential comment in relation to discussion around a legal memo, but Jane brought up that there's an intent to write a memo to share at the council around the climate action office support and technical assistance for the climate council. So to really outline that and put it on paper. So there's an intent to sort of lay that out in writing. We don't have it right now, but that should answer at least part of your question.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really important to know, because capacity is going to affect our ask in terms of data and analysis. The state's got to be able to not only manage the contracts, but maybe even participate and add value to the work we would ask a consultant to do. So knowing what this group, the new climate office, is capable of, I think would really affect our ask.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Marion, for reminding us of that. And I want to move back to, because we only have a few minutes left, process for the budget recommendations. And I'm just going to suggest that I think the task groups are already meeting ahead of that Labor Day week at least once. The building task group now to talk about the RFP, could also talk about budget priorities at that time. The transportation group, you meet every Monday and then some, probably. And maybe it's just the task groups meet and then come back for that September meeting, and to the extent can have something in writing to share a couple days in advance, that would be ideal. But if not, we can just discuss at our September meeting. I think these would be the initial ideas, not necessarily to decide upon, but to have the full climate council kind of start to get a sense of what we're thinking, of the scope and the breadth of budget asks, and then every subcommittee is going to have budget asks, so the council is going to have to eventually narrow down, or maybe not, but might want to narrow down their budget asks as well. But does that make sense for a path going forward? Task groups kind of take the lead on this. Okay, hearing no objection to that. So we'll take that as the path going forward. With one caveat, is that I want to open it for public comment right now, and I should have not decided that path yet before public comment. I apologize for that, because there may be other options that we're not considering. Is there any public comment on the process to identify budget priorities or general thoughts on budget priorities? Okay, seeing none, we'll continue on that path that I just outlined. Next steps, I think it is that week of September of Labor Day, so not the Monday, but if we can meet, perhaps September 8th is the Thursday, since this group meets on Thursdays at noon. Does that work for
TJ, that's the New England Winter the Winter Forum, which is, so there's a number of, like you, for example, who may not be able to go that day, and probably me. So might not be.
Thank you for that. Well, let's see. We could go to the 7th or the 9th. Or maybe the Wednesday might be better on the 7th. I see Liz and Bram and Joey. Science and Data has a meeting on the 7th, but it's at 2. And Gina, you can't make it. I don't know if we're going to find something that works for everybody.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I may be able to make it, but I can't count on it.
Yeah. And I was thinking that noon time frame.
Yes.
Okay. Let's try and schedule that for noon, and if we only after 2 for Dave, so noon isn't going to work.
That's okay.
For a couple people.
That's okay with me, TJ. We'll try to get our work done beforehand, and there will be others who can represent it.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. But let's try for the 7th at noon. If Marion, if you could send out a meeting invite and the Zoom link for that, or organize that would be great. And if enough people say they can't make it, then we may have to try and reschedule. and the main topic items will be one, the thermal sector RFP, the budget priorities, and kind of, there'll be 4 topics: the kind of review of the transportation task group document, and then kind of a high level path on the biomass task group as well. And hopefully we can organize to have a youth nominee for the subcommittee. Any other public comment generally that folks want to chime in on? Any other subcommittee comment? Graham, did you? I saw your box light up, but no. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. We covered a lot of ground today, so appreciate all the engagement. It's a good meeting, and we will see you all right after Labor Day, if not before.
Thanks for
everybody.
facilitating, TJ. That was.
Yeah, thank you, TJ.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good day.